Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar today on the infrastructures of maritime capitalism, flags of convenience and offshoring. My name is Jethro Norman. I'm a postdoc here at DIIS, and I've been really looking forward to today's talk. And there's a wonderful twist of irony today as well, in that during the webinar, or this webinar on infrastructure, there are also some major flood defences being installed right now outside DIIS. And today's activities also seem to involve a very large hydraulic hammer. So I apologize in advance if there is any background noise. And if you like, you can also consider it part of the sensory experience of the webinar. But first, I think one of the best things to actually come out of this trend towards webinars is that they're in some senses far more inclusive formats. So interesting people from all over the world can log on and can engage. And previously we've had people from the US, the Horn of Africa, and from other places in Europe too, which is brilliant. But of course, one of the downsides is that we can't see each other, and that can sometimes be slightly surreal too. So please do introduce yourself on the webinar chat box, and that way we can also generate a sense of who is present too. So this is actually the third of 4 webinars in a series on analytical approaches to infrastructure that I'm organizing here at DIIS with my colleague, Laleh Khalili.
Yeah, and my camera doesn't work in the moment. It has been switched off by the organizers, but hi everybody, I'm looking very much forward to this afternoon.
Okay, great, thanks Naya. And the idea behind this series is basically to investigate and to explore different analytical perspectives on infrastructure. So on the one hand, this notion of infrastructure is often tied up with the Enlightenment ideal of free movement, progress. It's kind of implicated in the development of modernity in the future. Yet infrastructures also exclude as much as they include. They encapsulate different political rationalities and have often multiple histories. I think as we might hear today as well, they're also bound up in various ways with violence, exploitation, and war. So Brian Larkin in our first webinar reminded us that infrastructures are objects of fantasy and of desire. Whilst Akhil Gupta in the last talk actually spoke about the social relations that infrastructures create and sustain, including these kind of new vectors of inequality. So I guess infrastructures can be a slippery concept and they're open to different interpretations, but we think it is nevertheless extremely productive as an analytical point of departure, precisely because it opens up space to critique and to break down traditionally held boundaries and distinctions. And so when Naya and I first talked about this series, we thought, well, we have nothing to lose by aiming high. And so we drew up a list of 4 of the best speakers we could think of. And we reached out to them, and all 4 miraculously said yes. And the first name I had written down was Laleh Khalili. And so we're very grateful to have Laleh here today. So Laleh is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University in London. Her research comprises infrastructures, political violence, war, the politics of gender and masculinities, collective memory, amongst other issues. She's the author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, and also Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies. So she's written extensively on the infrastructural power of the military and the infrastructures of counterinsurgency too. Her latest book, however, is The Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is a deep dive into how maritime infrastructure is not simply an enabling adjunct of trade, but is central to the very fabric of global capitalism. And it's a really impressive book, not only for its scale and its ambition, its meticulous attention to historical detail too, but also it's very persuasive and has a very poetic kind of writing style. Which very evocatively brings the subject matter to life. So I'd recommend you go out and buy it immediately. And finally, following Laleh's talk, we will have a Q&A, and there's space for you to write your questions, which is separate to the chat box. It should be next to it, so please write them there. I'm told you can also like specific questions if they're particularly interesting, which will then move them up on my screen as well. So Laleh will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will move on to the Q&A. So without further ado, Laleh, the floor is yours.
I'm on mute, sorry. Thank you very much, Jethro and Naya and DIIS for inviting me and for the incredibly efficient organization that went into setting this up, and for such a very, very warm introduction. And I'm incredibly grateful that you actually mentioned how Brian Larkin and Akhil Gupta had actually talked about infrastructure, because in fact, what I'm going to be doing in my specific talk today is to talk about another form of infrastructure, which is not necessarily what one thinks about when one thinks about infrastructures. So in Sinews of War and Trade, I actually have written extensively about the physical infrastructures. My undergraduate degree is in engineering, and so I do have a kind of an interest in precisely this kind of a material infrastructure that makes things possible. But what I'm going to be doing today is going to be talking about more global legal infrastructures that actually underpin the maritime industry. And given that you guys are in Denmark, or at least this talk is kind of virtually emanating from Denmark, and given that Maersk is often competes with Lego actually as being the #1 or #2 company in terms of size and income in Denmark, and given that Maersk is the #1 shipping company in the world, actually, this is in some ways also a little bit of a kind of a poetic connection, if you will, to Denmark itself. So to begin with today, what I want to do is I want to mention 2 events that have happened within the last few months. So on 25th of July of this summer, the merchant vessel Wakashio ran aground on a coral reef in Mauritius, and about 4,000 tons of fuel that was in the ship itself. The ship was an ore carrier, so the ore was in the ship itself, but as the ship grounded, it had about 4,000 tons of fuel in it, and the fuel began leaking, causing an ecological catastrophe. Now, what was particularly significant about the ship that broke on that coral reef, that started leaking on that coral reef, was that it was owned by a Japanese firm, but it was flagged to Panama, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. The owner and operator of the ship was Nagashiki Shipping, which is based in Okayama in Japan, and it's a private company. So it owned the physical ship, but the ship was chartered by a company called Mitsui OSK, and it was flagged to Panama, meaning that it flew the flag of Panama, therefore obeying the regulatory processes set up in the Panama Ship Registry. So keep that in mind. One owner, a different charterer, and a flag that has nothing to do with Japan. And the ship was going with 20 sailors to Brazil from Japan through the Indian Ocean, which is when it hit the coral reef. So who's responsible for this, and who's going to compensate the Mauritians for the devastation that this has caused to their economy? Is it the owners? Is it the people that chartered it and therefore are responsible for the accident itself? Is it the Panamanian Registry? So that's the first story. The second story is one that is very close to my heart because it took place in Beirut, where a lot of the research that I conducted for my first and second books was conducted in, and I feel that it's really a home away from home for me. The second event that happened in Beirut happened on the 4th of August. And as you probably know, it was the explosion of some 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that was stored in a warehouse with, I mean, this is what's astonishing about it. It was stored in the same warehouse as several 100 kilos of fireworks and several 100 meters of fuse used for explosions, industrial explosions. The explosion resulted in the deaths of upwards of 200 people, the displacement of 300,000 people, and the devastation of large swathes of Beirut, including an area in which I had actually stayed. It was very much decimated. So not the whole thing didn't fall down, but a lot of the buildings were unusable. What had happened in Beirut was that in September 2013, so 7 years ago, a cargo vessel called merchant vessel Roses, which was owned by a Russian, was registered to a company in Bulgaria, and it was flagged to Moldova. set sail from Batumi in Georgia to go to Mozambique. It carried this cargo of ammonium nitrate that was purchased by Fábrica de Explosivos de Mozambique, which is a company that makes commercial explosives used in mining. The vessel was operated by 8 Ukrainian and 2 Russian crew members, and they had not known that the crew that had left the ship before they come on board had not actually been paid. And in fact, that is why they had left the ship. So because the ship was in this kind of a dodgy situation, its owner, the Russian guy, wanted it to stop by Beirut to pick up some extra cargo that had not been in its original manifest. The ship arrives in Beirut. The Lebanese officials impound the ship for breaching a number of different regulations, but for primarily for failing to pay fees, port fees that were owed to Lebanon. Now, ships can be arrested in this way. And so the ship's owner refused to actually pay the fees, declared bankruptcy in order not to have to pay, and abandoned the ship. And so what happened in effect was that the crew of the Roses were left on board the ship in 2013. They were essentially became hostages in the negotiation between the Lebanese port authorities, who did not want to assume the responsibility for the ship's ammonium nitrate, and the ship owner, who was refusing to pay up. This meant that essentially a number of these crew members were on board the ship for almost a year with its explosive cargo in a ship that was leaking, with no wages and no access to electronic communications, and they had a dwindling supply of food and fuel. So finally, in about after a year of spending that time on the ship, in August of 2014, a Lebanese judge ordered the seafarers be released and the cargo be moved from the vessel to a warehouse in the port of Beirut. Usually under such circumstances, the cargo of a ship can be sold. And from that, the monies owed to the port, at least, and sometimes owed to those who worked on the ship, be recuperated. But what is interesting about this, and we don't know everything about this, and this, of course, an element of the story is also the fact that there's incompetence and corruption also involved in this. But the cargo never went anywhere, and finally, 7 years later, resulted in the massive explosion which devastated Beirut. So what all of this tells us is that there are a series of problems involved in maritime ownership and ownership structures and sort of usage structures of the maritime industry, which causes enormous amounts of problems, particularly when it comes to the regulation of labor and environmental issues. Now, one of the most significant and insidious methods of disciplining labor has been the introduction of flags of convenience, which is in effect offshoring the ownership for offshoring the ship's ownership elsewhere to somewhere other than the nationality of the actual people that own the ship. So open registries where ship owners can flag their ships to a different country's flag are called flags of convenience by the International Transport Workers Federation. In the words of John McPhee, a wonderful essayist who's written a couple of books about transport infrastructures, John McPhee says the convenience being that taxes can be avoided, insurance can be to a considerable extent ignored, and wages attractive to ship owners can be paid to merchant sailors drawn from any part of the world. End quote. And so this is precisely the point of many of these open registries, which they are, they essentially allow an outlet for not obeying regulations that would control a ship's behavior vis-a-vis environmental concerns, but also vis-a-vis the people that are working on board the ship. The world's most famous flags of convenience are Panama and Liberia, among many others, Marshall Islands, Cyprus, Honduras, and Bahamas among them. And all of them, what is actually also quite striking, is all of the most significant and most powerful flags of convenience tend to be allies or clients of the US, these flags of convenience. But open registries are not limited to these flags of convenience. So around the end of the 1970s, as there was a full-blown attempt to contain the gains of labor, at least in the global north, a number of the countries around Europe also began establishing open registries. So Denmark, for example, ships, Maersk, can flag its ships to Denmark, but there are two different flags. There is one, the Danish flag, and then there is an open registry or in an international registry, which has much laxer sets of regulations, but which allows a ship to fly the Danish flag. It's still got better regulations than some of those flags of convenience, in part because ships that are flagged to Denmark can much more easily come within the waters of EU. So that is something to keep in mind. Open registries were actually devised in the early 20th century, and they were in some senses analogous to the way that concessions were granted to British companies at the time. So if you remember, during the sort of the high imperial period, British colonial officials would control a particular country, and then they would actually then grant often British companies concessions over the natural resources of that country. So it would be those concessions often benefited the private sector in the country which had colonized the colonized place with natural resources. That is exactly how the open registries also functioned. And it was an overseas bounty that was often given to metropolitan companies by metropolitan colonial power at the expense of the overseas countries. So in Panama, in Liberia, and in Honduras, which were the first three flags of, in that order, the first three flags of convenience, the companies that were set up to manage the ship registries, to collect the fees, and to essentially control and regulate them, were actually headquartered in the US, and they were operating according to US corporate guidelines. So what is fascinating about this is that this actually continues until today. So the Marshall Islands Ship Registry is headquartered, and Liberia's, they're both headquartered in the state of Virginia in the US. And so a certain amount of the profit from the ship registries is actually expatriated to the US. The most egregious in the initial stages, the most egregious of these ship registries, international ship registries, was that of Liberia, which was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the person who set it up was famously Edward Stettinius, who had been Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of State and the very first US ambassador to the United Nations. He set up a ship registry whose headquarters are still, even today, located in Vienna, Virginia, and which repatriated somewhere around 60% of the profits of the ship registry to the corporation back in Virginia. 10% was sent to a development fund in Liberia, and the rest, about 25%, went to the Liberian government. As Rodney Carlyle, who's the prime historian of open registries, writes, for public consumption, Stettinius promoted the operation in non-profit and humanitarian terms. But for other more specialized audiences, such as investors or Liberia company executives, Stettinius hinted at the profit possibilities in the rich iron deposits at Bomi Hills, which rivaled Swedish ore for purity, and which could be transported out of Liberia using those ships flagged to Liberia. So there was an entire set of processes of extraction and shipping involved together and completely hand in hand, bound together. From the very first, extraction on colonial terms was interwoven with shipping at its most exploitative, profit-maximizing form possible. So the earliest ships to be flagged to the Panamanian and Honduran flag, interestingly, were the banana boats of the United Fruit Company and the tankers of Standard Oil. So these are the two companies that, if one actually reads any history of the Latin America, knows that these were sort of methods, these were conduits of economic extraction from Latin America to the United States. And so it's also fascinating that the ships that were going to be operating on them were so significantly on ship registries. I did some research about tankers in particular, and the tankers that operated in and around the Arabian Peninsula. And so what becomes really obvious and quite interesting is the extent to which these shipping companies, those early tanker companies, actually benefited from the savings that they could make and from the sort of escaping the regulatory apparatuses that they could enact through these open registries. So Standard Oil of California, which I just mentioned as being one of the first and most major beneficiaries of the open registries, was a parent company of both Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO, and of Aramco. Aramco was nationalized in the 1970s, but between when it was established in the 1930s and the 1970s, it was one of the primary shareholders. In fact, the main shareholder in Aramco was the Standard Oil of California. And so what is fascinating is that at the start, what we see is if in 1900, ships that are going through some of these ports that are in the Arabian Peninsula, about 50%, 56% of them were flagged to Britain and only 3% to the US. So this is in around 1900. But by 1948, 10% of tanker tonnage was being carried on ships flagged to Panama. So Panama alone, among the flags of convenience, carried 10% of world's tanker tonnage, even though it itself had absolutely no interest in oil whatsoever. US-owned tankers dominated the flags of convenience pretty much throughout history. So in 1970, at the height of the sort of the oil era, if you will, 65% of all tankers flagged to Panama and 40% of all Liberian flagged petroleum carriers were US controlled ships. So these were ships that were owned in the US, but which were flagged to Panama and Liberia. And one of the things that is really fascinating about this is that, of course, the companies that flagged these ships not only expatriated the profits, but also acted in ways that were actually often detrimental to the country which they nominally belonged to. So, for example, International Registries, Inc., which today operates the Marshall Islands Open Registry and represents the country in international maritime conferences. So they are who represents Marshall Islands in these conferences, is actually itself based in Reston, Virginia, in the US, and at various companies that have attempted to limit emissions from ships in order to prevent climate change and attendant rise in sea levels. International Registries has actually vetoed any effective action, which ironically increases Marshall Islands' exposure to oceanic inundation. So they are acting in ways that are diametrically opposed to the interests of Marshall Islands, which they are nominally working in. Flagging ships to Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands is not only one way to sort of try to avoid taxation or try to hide polluting machinery from inspection, but also most significantly, it's a way to pay crew members a lot less. So the absence of regulatory strictures means that ship owners can set wages in ways that best benefit them. So for example, US shipping companies took the US to court and in 1963 managed to secure a Supreme Court ruling in which they essentially managed to actually negate any role that unions could play. And although they tried to scupper certain regulations in the US, which requires US flags in at least for coastal trade, that's usually called the Jones Act, they nevertheless managed to pretty much allow for foreign flagging, for open registry flagging for all of their other ships. And what this resulted in was, because now the unions had actually little or no control over the sailors that worked on these open registry flags ships. In 1982, Exxon, which is Standard Oil of California, reported that tankers carrying 28 seafarers had to pay $2.5 million if they were flagged to the US. But the same tanker carrying the same 28 seafarers, if it was flagged to the Philippines, it only had to pay $560,000. So from $2.5 million to $560,000 in wages. And so this was actually, as you can see, this was actually an incredibly sophisticated and complex method through which wages could be, the amount of the wage paying could be offset. So this is one way that we see and avoidance. It's a major infrastructure, and it's a very significant element of the maritime industry today. Upwards, close to 50% of the world's ships on transoceanic journeys are actually flagged to flags of convenience. Now, one can ask, why is it that not all ships are flagged to flags of convenience? That is because in some countries that have come around and for a variety of reasons have at least limited certain entry of flags of convenience because of certain different kinds of regulations. So in the US, as I mentioned, the Jones Act prevents any ship that's not flagged to the US to actually do any kind of coastal trade. This is a kind of a residue of the power of maritime unions, and it goes back all the way to the 1920s. And what the effect of this, of course, is also quite interesting, because on the one hand, it protects. So there's a lot of contradictions and complexities within this. And I think this contradiction is something that I want to mention. So on the one hand, the Jones Act protects the wages and the jobs of American seafarers, US citizen seafarers on these coastal trades. But on the other hand, one of the fascinating things that has happened is when recently, for example, Puerto Rico was hit by two hurricanes in 2 subsequent years. And there was a desperate need for aid because of the Jones Act, because Puerto Rico is essentially a colony of the US. It's not recognized as a state, but it is territorially part of the US. Only ships that were flagged to the US could go to Puerto Rico to deliver aid of any sort. And of course, that massively limited the amount of aid that could arrive. So it had this kind of a contradictory effect that on the one hand, it protected the workers in the US, but on the other hand, in Puerto Rico, which received proportionally very little aid, this ended up being quite a problem. One final thing that I just want to mention is that in addition to the flags of convenience, there's one other element of ship ownership that is quite significant. And that is also something that we can talk about in the question and answer as I wrap this up. And that is that shipping ownership often falls into one of two categories. You either have privately owned shipping companies, actually three categories. You either have privately owned shipping companies, which is the vast majority of the largest shipping companies that are European are family owned of some sort. They often have families at the heart of it. So lots of Norwegian tankers, Maersk itself, CMA CGM, MSC, these are all family owned. The second is state owned shipping companies or partially state owned shipping companies, which is China. And a number of the Southeast Asian countries. And so in those instances, the state has a significant control over who these shipping owners are. But there is a third category, which I find also fascinating, and that is that these kinds of shell companies that are owned, and it is not entirely clear who owns them and who charters them. And often the ownership of these are in places with very lax corporate registration rules. Now, you would think that these corporate registration lax companies would be similar to the kinds of places that flagging also happens. So places that there are fewer restrictions, legal restrictions. But I just want to end with one note and to open the floor to questions, is that actually the United Kingdom's Company House is supposed to be, and according to the US Treasury's investigators, actually one of the worst offenders in terms of registration of companies, with minimal amounts of control, minimal amounts of regulation, minimal amounts of overseeing. Now, we hear about this in the cases of money laundering, but I think one of the more significant elements is that in these forms of ship ownership, responsibility is diffused and hidden in instances where it truly endangers not only the workers aboard the ships, but precious environmentally sensitive areas, as it has happened with Mauritius. I can talk a lot more, so do ask questions, but it is, I think, but these infrastructures, both ownership and flagging within the maritime industry, have emerged not because of illegality, but precisely because these fully legal infrastructures aid the development and accumulation of capital. And I think in that sense, they have to be recognized as important infrastructures. Thank you very much. Sorry for overrunning.
Thank you so much, Laleh, for such a captivating presentation. That was great. And so much to think about and to discuss as well. I think, particularly like the Beirut example, I think that really tragically in some ways crystallizes some of the issues at the heart of this open registry system.
Yes.
But perhaps to kick the discussion off, the first kind of question that sprang to mind to me before we open to the floor was also about the kind of visibility and invisibility of these infrastructures as well. Because it's interesting, in some of the ways what you're describing with the flags of convenience regimes, they carry many of the characteristics actually of land-based labor processes associated, like to mining, for example. I've done some research in you have ethnic segregation of the workforce, strict labor discipline, repetitive tasks, you know, this combination of workplace and life world very much within a single confined space. Yeah. But then it's also clear that the conditions of late capitalism are intensified at sea and kind of in some ways rendered more invisible. Yeah. So there's this rich irony between the system of open registers that actually successfully hides some of the world economy's worst kind of working practices and more opaque ownership and taxation structures.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I guess my question on that was what is it specifically about the maritime domain that enables this kind of intensification?
I mean, I think part of this is sort of the long history of maritime control at the seas. So sovereignty is very fuzzily defined at sea, which has often allowed for those who have the most power to actually project their power. So I joke, but it is entirely true that, for example, mare liberum, free navigation of the seas, is only free for those who can defend it with the cannon of the gun, and so, or with the force of the cannon. So in some senses, that fuzziness, that sovereignty, and the ways in which that actually brings to the fore the most powerful is one of the things that is quite significant about maritime trade at sea. It also allows all sorts of really dodgy behavior. For example, stowaways can be chucked into the sea. There have been instances recently, actually, was reported where I think a ship broke down and another ship was passing by, and it actually opened fire on the fishermen that were struggling to get, for whatever reason. It's not entirely clear what was the cause for that, but nobody was punished for this for 7 or 8 years, except for that a couple of advocates actually pursued this and finally brought this to fore. But for nearly a decade, somebody was shot at sea, loads of people witnessed it, videos, there was nobody to do that. So these are all kind of illicit things that happen, long histories, but there's also something very specific to the maritime industry, which actually has similarities to some of these large extractive industries which you mentioned, which is that again, company ownership matters enormously for this kind of viewing. And there's some, as I said, these kinds of shell companies. This company owns that company, and that company owns another subsidiary, and the subsidiary is owned by somebody else. And each of these places are registered in one corner of the globe, and they take advantage of they do forum shopping for the places that have the laxest rules, etc. But the specificity also of family ownership in some of the largest shipping companies is actually another hiding mechanism, because these companies don't have to provide a annual report to investors. They don't have to, and those annual reports to investors provide a kind of a minimal area where you can actually see the reality of how these companies operate. They don't have to do that. And so in a way that also acts fully legal, completely and totally legal, in fact, celebrated. The family that own Maersk are probably some of the most respected and loved people in Denmark, at least by the mainstream population. But that mechanism ends up being a very successful mechanism to actually hide what happens behind the closed doors. And I think that also, as I said, that's completely legal. But it's this assemblage of licit and illicit, legal and illegal, that is very much defines the worlds of maritime, both land-based and maritime, marine infrastructure.
Super interesting, thank you. And I guess whilst we're waiting for questions to come in as well, one of the corollaries of that is also, and this is something I think you've done well in the book as well. Often when we're talking about maritime infrastructure, or we're talking about flags of convenience, it's very kind of detached in some ways from the actual the people who are actually involved in this. So yeah. I wanted to ask you as well, how can we better bring out these kind of more subaltern voices, if you like, at the core of this, for example, on flags of convenience, and particularly perhaps the effective and the embodied experiences of those who kind of live and work and sometimes die on these maritime infrastructures.
I mean, obviously, talking to some of the seafarers is one of the most effective methods of actually hearing these voices. Actually, one of the other things that you mentioned in passing, I actually used an enormous amount of literature and poetry in my work, in part because that ends up being one of the conduits via which people that often don't appear, whose voices don't necessarily appear in academic works, do also convey something of their experience. So there's actually a huge body of maritime literature, real literature. As an academic, I can say that a real sort of literary literature that actually deals with the maritime. But now, in more recent times, there have been a number of people that have done ethnographic work actually on board ships, and some of the work that is emerging out of that is absolutely fascinating. One is, for example, Johanna Markula, who's a Swedish or Norwegian, sorry, forgive me, Norwegian anthropologist who actually did her PhD research on board ships. Charmaine Chua, who is now teaching at University of California, Santa Barbara, actually also did quite a lot of work, ethnographic work on board ships. I took a couple of trips on ships. I actually join Facebook groups of seafarers whenever I can. It actually happens to be one of the most raw and immediate ways in which you can get what's going on without necessarily having to pay the sort of the expensive fees necessary to become a passenger on board the ship. But I think that is really, really important, this ways of hearing them, because I'm not entirely sure that the representation always works in the ways in which we want. So International Transport Workers Federation has done some really great work in trying to sort of get flags of convenience to be more responsible. But one of the elements that happens when International Transport Workers Federation does some of the work that it does is that some of the unions that operate in the Global South find that what International Transport Workers Federation does, for example, puts their workers out of a job. So global lines of fissure around, which are actually very familiar from early 20th century during the colonial period, end up emerging in places that you don't necessarily expect. So I did a lot of research in the archives, and it was fascinating to see how many conflicts local unions in the Global South had, for example, with European-based global unions. And so these and then of course you have as you mentioned, the bifurcated wage regime aboard the ships, where you have the officers often from Eastern Europe nowadays, and the crew you often have from the Global South, or Russia, or China. And so that you end up again having these kinds of clashes on board ships too. So that to me is, there are all sorts of barriers, which makes it incredibly difficult to think about forms of mobilization together. But listening to people actually provides you some sense of what those barriers are and where the lines of fissure may be that, potentially could be addressed through mobilization.
Great, yeah. And I think it's a really interesting point that you're making actually about the Facebook groups. My research is with private security contractors, including maritime private security contractors, and I never made it on board a ship in that particular thing, but the Facebook groups are very interesting, and actually the hotels where they stay before they board, and if you can get into there and talk to people there, I think that's also very interesting spaces to find out more about that kind of stuff. I
actually did that. I stayed in a seafarer's hotel, and I was the only woman who was staying there. There are a few women. I think there's less than 1% of seafarers in the world, or a much smaller percentage. But I did stay in one of these hotels in Marsaschlock in Malta, and it was fascinating because first of all, seafarers are also a kind of a younger bunch by and large, and so here I was. I could be as old as the mothers of most of the seafarers that I was seeing there, and they were all young men, and so it was this kind of a weird thing where they were going, "What are you doing in this hotel? This is not the kind of hotel that women stay in." So that was also quite an interesting moment. But then the ship was actually where I did most of the conversation, and it was absolutely amazing. So that was quite an interesting experience.
Great, thanks. And we've got a few questions coming in as well now. So one from Peter Darling is asking about China and its influence in Asian waters, for example, with more aggressive Coast Guard operations. Are they changing the status quo, or is this introduction of China changing the status quo as far as operational practices at sea and expectations of a kind of global effect on operational practices?
So that's a really interesting question, because of course, a lot of the time when people are talking about China, particularly when you're talking about them in a kind of a context of politics and international relations, a lot of the focus tends to be on the coercive use of sort of projection of power by China. And as you mentioned, sort of the aggressive Coast Guard operations. The thing about it is, though, that where China is actually transforming the world of trade is not through those coercive means, and not even in South China Sea. Where it does it is through the sheer presence of Chinese capital, some of it state-owned, some of it para-state-owned, some of it private, in shipping, number one. Number two, through the increasing injection of Chinese seafaring labor into the market. So until very recently, the Philippines was the number one provider of seafarers in the world. It has recently been surpassed marginally by China, but China is soon going to outpace even the Philippines in terms of providing the seafarers. Of course, what the effect of that is that there are everyday effects. So for example, it probably will change the language in which the lingua franca of shipping, because the moment that you have the vast majority of the people on your ship speaking Chinese, it is going to affect who is going to speak in what language to whom. And I think that that's going to be a factor that's going to be quite significant. And I think in other ways, it's also going to be important because it is going to change the sort of the face of labor in shipping. This may not always be a positive thing, because of course one of the events, one of the instances in which the Chinese state has actually violently put down, before COVID, violently put down mobilization by a group of workers was in ports. And so they actually there was a port worker kind of revolt and attempts at wildcat strikes, and those were violently met by the state. And so I think this is going to be one place to, I think, really look if one wants to see what the effects of China in the globe is. One thing that I do want to say about the Coast Guard, though, which I think is quite interesting, is that China may show its force using these Coast Guards. When I was teaching at SOAS about 2 years ago, one of my very last brilliant undergraduate dissertation supervisees was actually a German woman who was researching the US Coast Guard's presence in ports worldwide. And it was something that I actually wasn't even aware of. But she ended up researching the US Coast Guard. She ended up interviewing the US Coast Guard attaché in Hamburg. And it turns out that the US Coast Guard actually has decided that its border is not the maritime or land borders of the US. It is wherever there's a port from which a ship can come into the US. And therefore, it has a Coast Guard presence all around the world, or at least in the world's largest shipping hubs. And to me, that was fascinating, because of course, this is part of the liberal structure of power that has shored up US imperial position in the world, metropolitan position in the world for, since the Second World War. And I wonder if that erosion will happen not through Chinese show of force in the South China Sea, but through the Chinese beginning to have attachés, Coast Guard attachés in all the ports from which ships sail to Chinese ports.
Great, thank you, Laleh. And we've got a couple more questions as well, which I might actually bundle together, actually, a few of them. So Clara Shade-Pulsum asked a great question, actually, on the extent to which the illegality on land, for example, such as tax havens, and the legality of maritime infrastructure intertwines. So both have a similar structure of accountability, but how might this difference in terms of the strength of sovereignty on land versus at sea influence the degree of legality or illegality of these mechanisms?
That is absolutely a brilliant question. And the thing about it is that legality and illegality are actually, the lines between them are profoundly blurry, not only in practice, but actually in law. And as I was just saying, the UK Companies House, United Kingdom, the former sort of imperial metropole in the world, its company registration mechanism is considered by the US, its special friend, to be absolutely deficient. And this is a fully legal instrument for registration of companies, and yet it is used incredibly comfortably to launder money, but also to register companies in all sorts of dodgy ways. That same kind of legal illegal boundary thing also happens in the maritime, and it happens both under a legal umbrella and under an illegal one, and often it is very difficult to prize those apart. If I can actually suggest a book that deals with this historically, Johann Matthew, a historian of the Indian Ocean, has written a wonderful book about the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, called Margins of the Market, which is precisely about what happens in these marginal spaces, in these between and betwixt spaces, where licit and illicit actually often are interwoven. And what he specifically is talking about is gun running, gold smuggling, and actually slave running from the east coast of Africa to across the Indian Ocean. But he deals with how in this system that is completely and constantly policed for its illegality, legal actors have a very significant role. And so his thinking is absolutely brilliant and completely in line with how I think of that illegality working hand in hand. I really recommend his book. Again, his last name is Matthew and his book is Margins of the Market.
Great, we'll have to check that out for sure. And this next question also relates to this, the previous question in the relationship between sovereignty, territory, and kind of appropriation as well. Ahmed Musa, who's joining us from Hargeisa, I believe, in Somaliland, is asking if you could chat briefly about the capital accumulation in the maritime space of post-conflict and fragile contexts. He's talking about the accumulation of illicit capital is even worse in so-called stateless and post-conflict countries. And speaking specifically about illicit fishing, piracy, and the dumping of toxic waste and other resources in countries like Somalia, which is a case in point.
Absolutely. And actually what is really interesting about that is that the moment where you have this kind of a breakdown of regulatory mechanisms, whether because it's a post-conflict situation, as is the case of the Somalia and Somaliland, and or it is simply because the states do not have the necessary capacity to enforce capacity or will to enforce those regulations. I think it's really important also to acknowledge that in many places the state are the people are extremely adjacent to the people who are accumulating the capital. That is certainly the case in for example, the countries of the Gulf, where the ruling families often are also very closely tied to or are themselves the capitalists. So in both of those cases, where you've got a post-conflict situation where the regulatory mechanism is broken down, or where you have a state that is completely and totally overlapping within the processes of capital accumulation, what you end up having is the flourishing of these supposedly illicit businesses. And so, of course, we've seen the devastation of the fishing grounds in Somalia, which resulted in a lot of the fishermen losing their livelihood and going into piracy. But there are other instances where such things also happen. And I think, to me, what's quite interesting about this is that, of course, in addition to piracy, another job that some of the people who've lost their livelihoods in fishing have gone into, and that is smuggling people across the Bab al-Mandab to Yemen. And so you have people that are escaping incredibly difficult situations at home because of drought or because of conflict conditions or for other reasons, who are going to Yemen and hoping that from Yemen, which is itself a war zone, to go from Yemen then onwards to Oman and to the Gulf or into Saudi Arabia. So you have this emergence of these illicit businesses. And what is really important to remember is that these illicit businesses at the ground level are often, under the lens. So you have the security forces, you have the EU NAV4's presence. When my ship went through the Red Sea and through the Gulf of Aden, it was amazing how many different world Navy ships, naval ships, vessels were floating around in that area. But what is and who they were targeting was a hungry fisherman from Somalia or Somaliland who was riding a skiff and was trying to get on board a ship. But what is really important to remember is that these guys who are riding that skiff and who've got machine guns and are going to try to engage in these kinds of illegal behaviors are actually often producing monies that doesn't go to them or to their communities. So they are in some senses also the exploited labor in an illicit business in which the surplus value of their labor is extracted and then laundered in, I don't know, in Nairobi or in Singapore, or in fact in the UAE, where a lot of the businessmen actually invest in these forms of illicit behavior. So you have this process of laundering that happens between that ground level fishermen, for example, who are doing the dirty, dangerous work of illegal whatever, whether it's smuggling or piracy or whatever, but then the money that is made through that, whether through getting ransoms or through the fees for crossing people across the sea, ends up going into the pockets of people who are driving SUVs and have Rolexes and are sitting in air-conditioned offices elsewhere. So I think that that is also really quite important to acknowledge, is that the economy that emerges around these ideas of legality and illegality often ends up acting to the detriment of the people who are most visible. So the pirate, the fisherman who's lost the human smuggler, but actually hides the people who did the financing of these very expensive businesses. You know, some of these boats that are used for piracy are incredibly fast. They're quite expensive. I don't know how a fisherman living in Somaliland would have been able to afford such an incredibly fast skiff that goes faster than any of these big, you know, massive ships. So that's also something to think about, I think.
Yeah, and gets back to our first sort of points actually quite neatly about visibility and invisibility, I think. Yes. And Jatin Dua's work on piracy and the economies of protection is great in that respect.
Yes, so absolutely. So Jatin Dua does the kind of work that Johann Matthew did for the end of the 19th century. He does it in terms of piracy in that area for contemporary. And he actually he didn't go on pirate ships, but he did go and talk to some of the fishermen, and he did go on some of the ships that actually provide security around there. And he talks about also this kind of a co-imbrication of the licit and the illicit. So his name is Jatin Dua, his last name is Dua, and I can't remember the name of his book, but he's got one book out which is about piracy. So
yeah, okay, so I think we can take maybe one more question and then think about wrapping up. So okay. We've got unless anything really good comes in.
Oh no, there's one that says, what can be done to change maritime infrastructure? Who are potential agents of this change? I actually think that that's a brilliant question. And I think that in part, it's a brilliant question because it's quite a complicated one. So I'll just give you some idea about what I think might work. So I would think that one of the ways in which this kind of work the infrastructure can be changed is through passing of regulations that will demand that these kinds of regulations actually act not only on behalf of the workers that need to be protected, not only on behalf of the environment for which somebody needs to speak for, because otherwise it's going to be destroyed, but also even on behalf of the states that are losing out on the taxation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that some of the ways that this can be done is, of course, the work that an organization like ITF does, International Transport Workers Federation, is, although controversial, although riven with all sorts of contradictions, is quite important. So there are all these kinds of international organizations, often representing workers, that are quite important. But in addition to that, I do think that lobbying of the various states is quite important in tightening their regulations. So these tightening of regulations happens not only on environmental stuff. So the EU has recently passed regulation that demands that shipping companies reduce their sulfur emissions. What that means is that then any ship that wants to actually come within the EU waters would really absolutely need to reduce its emissions. It needs to follow these regulations, and therefore it makes it incumbent upon shipping companies to, for example, change their ships so that they can, they can do that sort of regulatory compliance. But that same thing can be done in regards to labor. It can be done in regards to many of the other areas in which shipping companies operate. I also think that the interests of transparency are enormously important. And it shouldn't be the US, which has its own imperial interests in hand, that does demand that kind of transparency. The EU is outrageously bad about, for example, regulating its shipping companies. It allows for all sorts of monopoly or oligopoly conditions which nobody else allows. And in part, it is to protect its businesses, which is why you have the top 3 shipping companies in the world being in Europe, housed in Denmark, France, and Switzerland, Switzerland/Italy. But I think that that's, that kind of regulation also needs to happen in a place like the EU. And China, interestingly, is stepping forward with some of this change. Now, China is the factory of the world, and it controls so much of the world trade that I think that if it were forced into a position where it demanded the same kinds of regulatory compliances that an EU or the US can demand, then that might actually also change some of the infrastructures of shipping. What comes with that then, of course, is the problem of what do you do with a massive world power that also can demand all sorts of compliance from others. So there's that element as well, is that with that kind of ability to enforce rules comes a form of imperial projection of power. And so this is something that we as a public have to think about. But I also think that we as a public have to demand. It has to be something that we educate ourselves about and demand it from our governments at the very least.
Great, and we've got perhaps one last question as well from Jafar Alul. He says, thank you for your talk. And he's asking, it leads on quite nicely, I think, from the previous question about, he's asking about Gulf capital investing in global shipping. So I guess we tend to think about the West and Lloyd's of London and these kind of big kind of epicenters of kind of power.
Brilliant question. Brilliant question. I actually do talk about it in the book, so I recommend that you read the book. But just to give you a quick answer here, I shouldn't be advertising my book, but to just give you a quick response, you obviously know about sort of the investment in ports. So for example, Dubai Ports World has concessions in ports in the Netherlands. In fact, Rotterdam Gateway, which is now one of the largest container terminals in Rotterdam, is operated by Dubai Ports World, as is London Gateway here. And there's other Gulf capital that also flows through other ports. So there's quite a lot of actually port concession presence that happens through Gulftainer or through Dubai Ports World. But as to shipping, rather interestingly, United Arab Shipping Company recently merged with a Hamburg-based shipping, which I'm drawing a blank because I'm absolutely old and my brain is not operating. But it was at the time that they merged together, they were that Hamburg-based shipping company was the 5th largest shipping company in the world. And it's joining with the United Arab Shipping Company, it actually became even bigger, and it took on the name of the name of the German company. The ownership infrastructures of that shipping company is actually also something that I write about in the book, which is quite interesting because partially it's the city of Hamburg, so you have a state-owned kind of interest in that. Partially, it is the investors of United Arab Company, but partially it's also the Qatar Sovereign Fund. So you have this interesting thing where United Arab Shipping Company, whose headquarters, one of its headquarters is in the United Arab Emirates, is having Qatari investors as well as Saudi investors investing in a Hamburg-based shipping company. Some of that is happening more or less, but I think where most of the capital investments go is in port infrastructure rather than shipping itself. Western shipping itself. There's a lot of locally owned shipping businesses.
Great, and I think regrettably due to time constraints, we're going to have to end it there. But thank you so much, Laleh, for such a great talk and a invigorating discussion as well. And thank you to everyone who's attended. Most of all, thank you to the construction workers outside who spared us the hydraulic drill this afternoon, which was a blessing. Of course, the next webinar in the series is with Kevin Donovan, who will speak about rentier infrastructure, debt, data, and sovereignty in Kenya. We hope to see as many of you there as possible too. But for now, thanks again.
Can I just jump in and say, I just want to shout out to my former PhD student, Andy Young, and also my good friend, also former student, Joe Farrick, both of whom were present here. And I just wanted to say, hi, I'm sorry I can't see your faces. I wish I could. And lots of love. And thank you so much for having me. That was very enjoyable. And I'm sorry I spoke so fast. Somebody mentioned that in the thing. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's great. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of the day.